Hello, thank you so much for coming. We have the Secretary of State is running a few minutes late, so what we're going to do in the meantime is we're going to start off with opening remarks from our wonderful panellists here, and then when she arrives, we will switch over to some remarks from the Secretary of State. So hello, welcome, thank you very much for coming. My name is Lynsey, I'm the Senior Climate Programme Manager here at the Conservative Environment Network. If you don't already know, the Conservative Environment Network is the independent forum for Conservatives in the UK and around the world who support net zero, nature restoration and resource security. And today we are here for the panel on Green Industrial Revolution. Is the UK winning or losing? Amazing timing. As I start the panel, the Secretary of State has arrived. So, right, we will kick off with some remarks, if that's all right. So thank you very much. Welcome to the Secretary of State.
Thank you so much. It is so great to be here, and I can see you've got my colleague David on the panel, so I hope you're going to have a good long discussion about carbon capture in Acorn, which, by the way, I entirely support. And just to say, I am one of you guys. I am a SEN member, and one of the reasons that I am is because part of my conservatism is that I believe that we are custodians of the things that we cherish. We absolutely must protect the environment for the next generation. And you'll know more than anyone else at this entire conference how far we've come and how ambitious we are in this country to decarbonise and make sure that we are playing our part in terms of climate change. But I'm also a conservative because I believe that you have to be pragmatic about things, you have to be practical, and you have to, above all, protect struggling households. So, as you'll know, one of my key roles is to make sure that we get to our net zero legal targets. Again, the most ambitious targets of any major country in the world. That's something that I take deeply seriously. You'll have seen the changes that you've made. I hope I can assure you to say I am still confident that we are going to get there. And actually, if you look at some of the way that we've changed things, I actually think we've changed things for the better. So, for example, in terms of heat decarbonisation, the way that people heat their homes, we've now moved to an incentive model because we've changed the boiler upgrade scheme. And the reason that we've done that is because when I looked at countries all over Europe, the people who had got there more quickly than us, it was because it financially worked for families. So actually, in terms of some of the noise, I would say look at the facts of what we're doing. The biggest thing that we announced last week, arguably, I would say was around the grid. Because what we really need to do to make sure we hit these ambitious targets is electrify pretty much everything in society. And one of the knotty challenges that we're all facing across Europe has been grid connections. So that's top of my list. But overall, we are ambitious, we will be innovative, and we can be practical. That's my message to all of you. And I'm so delighted to be here speaking at CEN, introducing the panel. I know you're going to have an excellent debate, and I'm sure that I'll be hearing great feedback from all of you. But if there's any people who are interested in this space, just to say, I'm here to engage. My door's always open. And thank you again to CEN for all the work that you do.
The Secretary of State has got a time for a very few short, snappy questions. I believe we have a roving mic at the back. If one of the SEND team can grab that. I saw one hand shoot straight up there. Finn, there's
Probably take a couple.
Yes, we'll take a couple in a batch. Please say your name and what organisation you're from.
Hiya, I'm Helena Horton from The Guardian. So earlier today you criticised those who view net zero as a religion. Plenty of people at Conservative Environment Network really care about net zero. Do you think they view it as a religion? Because some of them criticised the policy that you announced a couple of weeks ago.
Hi, Juliette Samuel at The Times. I wondered what your view is on the industrial policy side of this, which I guess is the title of this event, how we ensure that green jobs actually do materialise in the UK and we're not just buying everything from China to make this happen.
Thank you. Sorry, Tasha. Is that
You can have it.
Mike, I'm Glenn Coutinho from Octopus Energy, and I was going to ask, now that heat pumps are so much cheaper than boilers, how are you going to cope with the demand?
So firstly, I would say I am a Conservative Environment Network member, And what I was talking about when I made this point about net zero becoming a religion is that there are people who say that we can never question anything to do with net zero. We can never shift any policy that we've put in place. And that's not how governments should function. So we have hugely ambitious targets. We think it's really critical, but we also want to be really practical about it, which means that you have to look at the best ways to succeed to get there. And I think that is the overarching critical thing. Juliet, in terms of industry, a huge, really important part of my role is going to be opening my arms to investors, making sure that we're attracting people here. And there's lots of things that we've been doing to do that. So if you look at the CFD mechanism that we've had here, that's been really successful in driving renewable energy, for example. But you have to look at things like skills planning and the grid. Hugely important to make sure that industries can succeed. And across all of our different sectors, when I've talked to investors in my weeks in the role, they've said actually we are further than a lot of other countries when it comes to things like regulatory frameworks. And that's something which has been a really positive thing for this country. And again, whether you're looking at the future of any of these different industries, we've got so many things here, whether it's skills or planning or great sort of investment and capital markets that I think are positives that we need to make sure we're capitalising on. And then the last question, Octopus, which I'm really glad that since we made our announcement, your inquiries for heat pumps have gone up fivefold, which goes to show, I think, that success of making it an incentive model. And absolutely everything that we're doing is looking at how we can cope with that demand and doing our bit as government to make sure that we can help people get there. But thank you for all the innovation that you're doing as well.
Got time for one more question?
Sorry, I think we actually...
No problem.
Yeah,
Thank
brilliant.
you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you very much to the Secretary of State there for her speech and for taking a few questions, which we hadn't actually planned for. So, very grateful to the Secretary of State for that. But moving on to the panel discussion, as I said, we've got an incredible lineup of speakers with us here today. So first off, we have David Duguid, MP for Banff-and-Buchan and Chair of the 1922 Energy Security and Net Zero Committee. We've got Chris Skidmore, MP for Kingswood. He was a former Energy Minister and led the Net Zero Review. Got Laura Sands, who is the chair of so many organisations, I'll never be able to get through them, but chair of Green Alliance and former MP for South Thanet, and Chris O'Shea, the Group Chief Executive of Centrica, who are kindly supporting this event. So thank you very much, Chris. We're going to kick off with some opening remarks from our speakers, and then we'll come over to some questions from the audience. So please get thinking about those now. We'll stick to 3 minutes for opening remarks so we can get as many questions in as possible. And we are going to kick off with David for some opening remarks. So heading to that end of the table.
Thank you very much, Lynsey. Oh, a bit on the loud side. I'll step back a bit. I think in answer to the question is, so I'm reading it here, is the UK winning or losing? I think the UK is winning for the most part. I think there's still challenges we need to consider. I think the UK government's taken the right approach to reaching net zero. I really welcomed the report from my colleague Chris Skidmore, in particular the recommendation to consider carbon capture and storage sites based on readiness to start, not necessarily on the necessarily the big bang for buck, because I think we are ultimately going to need more carbon capture and storage than we already have planned. The government has made a series of ventures into low carbon technologies, including the potential rollout of hydrogen, and it's been very encouraging actually to see at this year's conference compared to previous year's conference the massive stand for carbon capture and storage and an equally massive hydrogen hub, and I've already been involved in a number of discussions, panel events, and roundtables all about energy and energy transition, and it's really encouraging to see the usual suspects, people like myself who are always banging on about energy and energy transition, but some people coming to the table for the first time and discussing what's actually required and the balance of not just delivering net zero, but also doing so while keeping the lights on between now and 2050, because we're not going to get to 2050 and keep the lights on without oil and gas in declining amounts. And as a result of that, we're not going to get to net zero by 2050 without carbon capture and storage. So it's really vital. I should actually declare an interest here. I've got the Acorn project in my constituency. So that's why I'm particularly interested in that particular technology. And I was delighted, of course, that was recently announced as one of the Track 2 clusters. So one of the 4 that's going to be operational by the end of the decade. But as I often say, it's one of the 4, but we're going to need more. And so that's one of the things I'm encouraging government to do more on. I think we could be a lot better. We could be delivering the energy transition, the technology and the skills better than we already are. But we should also be very careful not to forget the skills and the supply chains and the people who are already working with the technologies that already exist, particularly in, for example, the oil and gas industry, but other sectors as well, which we will need to transition. Now, that's not about taking oil and gas workers, putting them out of work, retraining them in new skills and then putting them to work on the renewable sector. It's about getting mechanical engineers, project managers, electrical instrument, all these skills that we're going to need to deliver the net zero future already exist, but we don't have nearly enough of them. And it's one of the reasons we've been talking about it for decades, about the need to get more and more young people into STEM subjects, particularly young women. And it's something, particularly in Scotland, I think we're falling a bit behind in terms of that particular remit. But I'm getting the nod from the chair, so I'll shut up there and look forward to answering some questions.
Thanks, David. Loads to unpack there. Skills, competitive advantage, perhaps for the UK in CCS and other areas. So hopefully lots to get into in the discussion. Chris, I'm going to come to you next. Are we keeping up with international competition? And are there any outstanding recommendations from your net zero review that you would like the government to implement?
So I think the answers to the question, winning or losing, the UK has been a climate leader. We've decarbonised by 50% of our emissions on 1990s levels. We've still got the most ambitious national determined contribution set for 2030 of 68% emissions reduction. And obviously the CCC's progress report in June shows that we are about 92% on track to meet that. Obviously there are policy gaps that we need to now, as legislators, scrutinise the government, particularly on the back of what's happened recently. But I would say actually the recent sort of announcements, I don't think change the dial very much. They do on minimum energy efficiency standards, but actually the EV mandate, effectively remains the same. And the net zero review and also the net zero strategy previously always set out there would be exemptions when it came to EVs. The net zero strategy always set out exemptions around heat pumps and boilers. And it seems like we've just carved out 20% on both EVs and boilers. So actually, very little has changed in terms of the policy. I think it's important to reflect, actually, when you look at what has been announced. I'm not actually sure if there's very much different. The big change is obviously minimum energy efficiency standards, where potentially that's going to cost households a significant amount in additional gas bills over a decade. But what we need for the future to maintain climate leadership is the certainty, the clarity, the consistency, the continuity of policy frameworks. And the announcement that was made has caused uncertainty. It has caused concern that is the UK willing to demonstrate future leadership rather than row back. It's undeniable that investors who are making decisions right at this moment in boardrooms around the country about where to place their investments are looking for that long-term certainty. And the challenge now is that while we have raced ahead, there are others who are catching up. If you look at Germany, they've got a 10-year hydrogen programme to complement their 10-year KfW programme on energy insulation. If you look at France, Macron has now committed to 1 million heat pumps under his prime runoff insulation scheme that's open to everyone, not just necessarily means tested. If you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, it's not just about the money, it's about that long-term certainty, the 45Q tax credit being in place to the 1st of January 2033. And that was the message of the Net Zero Review Mission Zero. If we want to maintain this climate leadership, we've got to be able to create a stable framework. And within that stable framework includes stable political consensus on climate. The Conservative Party backed the Labour Party to take forward the Climate Change Act in 2008. We didn't just back them, we urged them to go further, to sign up to 80% emissions reduction. On the back of that, the net zero mandate was able to be taken forwards on the back of the Climate Change Act. We are admired across the world because we have regulatory and policy certainty. And while we aren't going to be able to outgun the EU with their Green Deal, €1 trillion, or we're not going to be outgun the US with a $369 billion worth of investment on climate technologies, everyone looks up to us when it comes to designing the regulatory business models. If you look at the states, their EV targets, it's like 50% of EVs by 2030. We're well ahead of that. If you look at their energy efficiency regulations, New York is working to a different model than Boston. We have an opportunity to export great British net zero technologies and great British net zero standards if we so choose. And this is the moment in the race where almost it's a relay race, to misquote Boris Johnson, that the baton potentially is being handed over, and that baton could be dropped if we're not willing to set out leadership at the top in demonstrating that we are proud of our record on net zero, that net zero is not a cost, and actually delaying any measures will only cost householders more in additional gas bills, because this has been a cost of gas crisis, not a cost of energy crisis, and recognising that going further faster on net zero will result in significant savings being made. And that's where we can deliver to continue to lead in this global net zero race.
Wonderful. On the subject of cost, Laura, I'm coming to you next. Can the UK afford to respond to the USA's Inflation Reduction Act?
Well, I just wanted to say that I agree with both my colleagues here, or former colleagues as such, and reiterate some of the points. But can we afford? I don't think we can afford not to. And I think one of the particularly interesting elements of the Inflation Reduction Act is that it is very, very clear about manufacturing and local content. And picking up a point that somebody made in the audience to Claire was this issue about how do we build the industrial capability to actually deliver net zero, and I don't think we have got there. So if one's looking at what we're winning at, or winning at the moment, but as Chris rightly says, very much being caught up by others. Obviously, offshore wind is doing extremely well in terms of we've in many ways created the framework for that. And it's being deployed, despite the problems a couple of weeks ago where we didn't get an auction outcome. We are very good at whole systems thinking, and the future system operator is going to be a very crucial part of that. Sometimes not so great at whole system deployment, and delivery really matters. We're leading in energy digitalization, and that is moving forward pretty quickly. But what are we losing at, and where are the gaps? I would absolutely reiterate, we are losing momentum, we are falling back, and we have certainly lost confidence in the investor community, and that is going to cost us increased cost of capital for all these assets, which will end up being paid by you and me. So let's be frank, undermining the destination and confidence is not just a political issue, it has financial repercussions. Transmission, really, really important, and the one great thing about Rishi's speech was about grid, speeding up the grid planning system. You do not build a farm and then no roads to the farm, and that's what we've been doing. The second point on technology is storage. So storage is really, really important. Weather does not take price signals, by the way. It doesn't follow legislation. What is interesting is if you look at food, refrigeration, before refrigeration, we lost 60% of food. So what is storage in energy? Long duration storage, frozen food. Grid scale batteries, refrigerated warehousing. EV cars, by the way, by 2035, they'll be the equivalent of 2 nuclear power stations in terms of capacity of EV cars. That's flash freezing. The most important part of the food system, strangely enough, is the fridge in your home. Because if you didn't have a fridge in your home, supermarkets would have to be 4 times the size they are. So we have got to start really thinking about all these storage vectors that actually lower whole system costs and will deliver a much better, in many ways, what I call decarbonisation dividend to consumers and society. And the last thing that we're really missing is the customer side. Now, we've got very great companies like Centrica, Octopus, etc., delivering. But actually, we need to really turbocharge that demand side, because strangely enough, customers are really quite boring in comparison to weather. We are much more predictable and we're much more biddable. So we need to really think how to engage them. And the very last thing, and I say this with a bit of sadness, and I have fellow members of this group, was energy efficiency is the first fuel. That is the priority. And unfortunately, the Energy Efficiency Task Force was disbanded 10 days ago. And that is where you really deliver whole system cost reduction, energy security, but most important, you give citizens a cheaper price of electricity and gas. It has to be a priority, and we really have never cracked this one.
Wonderful, lots of challenges there. Hopefully we'll get some solutions from the audience if we're lucky. Chris, over to you finally. Where is industry in all of this debate?
In the middle of it all. So, I mean, in Centrica... Usually my voice is loud enough. In Centrica, we're the largest supplier of electricity in the UK, largest supplier of gas, one of the largest producers of gas, one of the largest producers of electricity. We installed the UK's first large grid-scale batteries. We're across the entire value chain. Where we move quickly, we do really well. So the UK moved very quickly on offshore oil and gas 50, 60 years ago. And we own a lot of the intellectual property, and it's brought a huge amount of income in. I heard the Secretary of State earlier today saying that we have the biggest, the second biggest, the third biggest, and the fourth biggest offshore wind farms in the world, in the UK, because we stole a march on that. So I think there are some things that are going incredibly well. I think, to Laura's point about insulating homes, I think that is really the energy efficiency. That is quite a problem. We spend over £300 million a year insulating our customers' homes, and what we find in that is you need to have a continuous supply chain or a continuous demand profile in order to build the supply chain, in order to get the costs down, in order to help do things for your customers. So what we do in Centrica, and what I think is going well in the industry, is we've got 10 million customers in the UK and Ireland, so we're in every third home in the country. So we know what they're looking for, and what customers are looking for is they don't care whether it's electrification, they don't care whether it's natural gas, they don't care whether it's hydrogen. They care that their house is warm, habitable, and at a cost that's affordable. And that's what we have to think about. That's what we have to not lose sight of. Now, I happen to think that as we do this, net zero is a massive value creation opportunity for the UK. And I think that what we've got to think about is we can't compete with the subsidies that are on offer in the US. And the Inflation Reduction Act, I think the number that Chris mentioned is the headline number of $350 billion. If you do the calculation, it's uncapped. It's probably $1.5 trillion that the US government are going to invest in this. The big worry that I've got is not that they're going to be making the parts that we're going to deploy in the UK, it's that they're going to own all of the intellectual property. And wherever the intellectual property is owned, that's where the value goes. So what we need to be doing, I think, is we need to be getting better at taking this whole systems approach and figuring out that what we don't need to do is to just build a lot more wind farms. Today we're burning coal. 1 gigawatt of our electricity right now is coming from coal-fired power stations. It's not very windy and it's not very sunny. So you could build another 100 gigawatts of wind farms, we'd still be burning coal today. We've got to think about long-duration energy storage. And one of the biggest areas that I think we're missing out is on hydrogen. And we've got this really unhelpful debate at the moment in the UK, which is, should we have hydrogen or not? What's the cost of it? What people are not telling you, what they're not being honest with you about, is that if we electrify everything, we don't have all of the electricity generation to do that. We've got to have something whereby we have electricity on demand when we need it, and that's a mix of we need a lot more wind, we need a lot more nuclear, we need a lot more hydrogen, we need more thermal generation, but we can't lose sight of the fact that right now in the UK we're burning coal to generate electricity because we're not taking this whole systems thinking, and because we're not moving as quickly as we did in the offshore oil and gas industry, in the offshore wind industry. But we can absolutely get there.
Great, some positivity, love that, a bit of optimism. So I'm going to use my chair's prerogative to throw a couple questions to the panellists, but please do get thinking. I'm going to throw over to Q&A in a little bit, and I want to get through as many questions as possible. So my first questions. So for the two MPs on the panel, I'm interested in the difference between the Conservatives and Labour and the offer that we're putting forward to manufacturers, to industry, to supply chains. How can we do it better? Do we have an offer that is more attractive? David, I wonder if you want to come in on this.
I guess I'm bound to say, as Conservatives, I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but I guess we do understand business better. We would always assert that. I mean, but how would we prove that? I think it's not that other parties don't understand business. I think it's a case of choice in terms of do we actually make the difficult choices, which outwardly may seem initially to be counterintuitive or counter to delivering net zero. So last week's announcement of Rosebank, for example, why could we possibly be encouraging the production of more oil and gas when we're trying to deliver net zero? And in fact, the fact of the matter is we're producing less and less oil and gas every day. And even with the addition of Rosebank and Cambo and Jackdaw and other oil and gas fields, we will continue to produce less and less oil and gas. We have been since the late 90s, early 2000s. And that will reduce faster than our ability to replace that demand with renewables. So we have to manage that balance. So producing new oil and gas is not counter to delivering net zero. It's a transition. We have to make the transition work. But I think, and it's that appreciation and understanding, and as we've seen with the Prime Minister recently, that capacity or capability, I'm reluctant to use the word courage, to stand up and say this is what we need to do. But it doesn't mean we're abandoning all our net zero targets.
Chris, do you agree that oil and gas is the wedge between us and Labour, or are there other areas where we've got an advantage over the opposition?
But I feel the challenge is obviously there is an emotional one, which is how do we as Conservatives recognise that there is evidence-based policy we have to follow, that we don't create a morality tale between good versus bad, between industries that for no fault of their own are high carbon historic industries that need to transition to industries of the future, and that, as Chris has said, there is a balanced mix, and even the CCC has said existing oil and gas will be needed. I personally do not believe in opening a new oil field that doesn't necessarily reflect the fact that actually there are choices to be made now in the transition. And that investment that the UK would make in a Norwegian company to produce oil that would be sold on an international market, does counterbalances the fact that that investment could go elsewhere in renewables, and actually the challenge is around those choices. And that's a debate that we can have, and it's important that we have a democratic process to debate these things. I think the other challenges are around the future of the energy mix. So the key one, regardless of all the politics around net zero, and obviously I would urge the Conservative Party not to bring net zero into a culture war. It is too important to play politics with this in the run-up to the general election. But there is dividing lines that we should be focusing on. So Labour have set out a net zero grid by 2030. I personally don't think that is feasible. This is the largest industrial challenge we are facing in terms of building out grid and infrastructure. And we have enough challenges around getting grid connections to 2035, let alone 2030 at the moment. And so making sure that we can set out a realistic policy that doesn't overpromise and under-deliver. And actually it's not all about government. The challenge is there are Conservative regional mayors, there are Labour regional mayors who are also setting out visions, whether it's Ben Houchin for Teesside and Net Zero Teesside, or whether it's Andy Street, using the Trailblazer project to focus on actually energy efficiency. We should be see this in 3D and not have this two-dimensional approach. So actually think it's all central government that is delivering. There are other challenges around technologies such as nuclear. I personally back nuclear as a base load. I believe in the Conservative Party's commitment to 24 gigawatts by 2050. Labour won't tell you what their base load for nuclear will be. I think it's a lot less than where the Conservative Party will go. And the welcome announcement today on the SMRs is something that I back. But will we see Labour back that as well? So I think there are technological distinctions which we should be having a fair debate on. Let's not go down a route of trying to say that somehow anyone who backs net zero is not proportionate, because net zero was already proportionate over a 27-year period. Just Stop Oil do not believe in net zero by 2050. They never have. They want net zero now. And the challenge is, if we try and lump everyone, including Conservatives who support a net zero pathway that's been carefully thought through, in with extremists, that serves no one any good.
Great, okay. I will save my other question and mix in with a few of the other ones from the audience. But we've got a roving mic ready? Okay, wonderful. Lots of hands up so far. Finn, if you mind coming down to the front, there's a batch of 3, which I'll just take in one go. Please do say your name and if you're representing an organisation. Please try keep it to a question rather than a comment. And I'll batch them all 3 together, and then I'll divvy them up between the panellists. Great.
Hi, Pierre Shepherd, Secretariat Lead of the APPG on ESG. Some of the commentary we've had is that we've got a lot of the solutions that we can export to the rest of the world. A big part of that equation is, of course, investment, and also that applies internally in terms of spreading out these solutions. However, we're behind, the EU in particular, in developing green markets. There are plans in place, but they're not going particularly quickly. So I'd like to hear some commentary on what the panel thinks we need to do to speed up the clock.
Fantastic. Next to you.
These fit very well together. My name is Miranda Barker. I'm the Chief Executive of East Lancs Chamber of Commerce, and we run a low carbon innovation agency. Replying directly to Laura's question, what are we missing? Commercialisation support. We're wonderful at innovation support, or we were before we lost the ERDF monies. We're not bad at Innovate UK type middle stage, but we're rotten at commercialisation, and that's why the IRA can pull all of this interest and manufacturing away. And we don't need to compete directly with the IRA, we just need to do enough to help the companies do the commercialisation step, so we get the scale up and we get the jobs, and then whatever investment goes in, you get 5 times the amount out within a couple of years. So it's short term.
Great, and then the third one at the end.
Hi there, Jonathan Leake, I'm the Energy Editor at the Daily Telegraph. I'm just picking up on something you said, David, which is about hydrogen. And my question is essentially, where do we get the hydrogen from? But you made the point that our oil and gas fields are running out. I think we've got 283 at the moment, and 180 are due to close by 2030. Our natural gas is diminishing by about 80% by 2030. The hydrogen strategy envisages hydrogen being made from gas for the first 20 years or so, and then switching slowly to electrolysis. So are we going to be importing LNG and then converting it to hydrogen, or what? Where's our hydrogen actually going to come from?
Great question.
Because that will be a very dirty process.
Great question. Okay, it's quite a lot to fit in there. I'm going to start with Centrica Chris, not MP Chris. And I'm interested particularly to hear your thoughts on a kind of exporting investment in the green markets in particular, but you may have some thoughts on hydrogen as well. And then, Laura, I'm going to come to you about the commercialisation, and then I'll come to David and Chris, MP Chris. Centrica Chris, over to you.
So I think to support the investment, so for example, we announced in Centrica recently a willingness to invest over £4 billion over the next few years in green energy. There are a few things which people have heard quite a lot about possibly today, which are causing problems. So firstly, grid connections. So we have billions of pounds to build power stations or batteries, but we can't get a grid connection. But we can fix that quite easily. I spent a lot of my time in the oil and gas business. When you got a license to explore for oil and gas, you gave a performance bond, you gave a commitment, you'd spend X amount of money. If you didn't do it, the government came along, very pleasant as they were, and said, give me the money. And we don't do that for grid connections at the moment, but we could. We could decide that in the next 2 or 3 months, we simply say to everybody in the queue, you have to give a financial commitment, and if you can't, you have to get out of the way. And for those of us that have got the money, we can then get going and really, really build out this new, clean, green energy infrastructure. On hydrogen, I think that one of the things we should really think about is that we have a massive geographical and geological advantage. in that we can change the flow of gas, which in Europe has traditionally come from east to west, to make it go from west to east. It can be a massive export opportunity for us. You make hydrogen in, well, there's three ways. There's some drilling that's going on just now, finding natural hydrogen. Now, that's quite early. I have no idea how that, we don't do any of that in Centrica. I have no idea how long that's going to take. But the other way is you electrolyse water, or you basically you break the methane natural gas into the carbon and into the hydrogen. Blue hydrogen is when you break natural gas down. We're surrounded by depleted oil and gas reservoirs, so we've got an almost unlimited area to store the carbon. Then when you're looking at electrolysing water, whether you use wind power, solar power, nuclear power, so you hear lots of different colours of hydrogen. We're a long, thin island. So ourselves and Norway, I think, are the two countries in Europe that can produce hydrogen at scale. Now, at first, some of the production, if it's blue hydrogen, probably will involve imported LNG. You've got to look at the whole carbon cost of the system, though, and see whether that is the lowest, as low carbon as it possibly can be. But ultimately, I think green hydrogen or pink hydrogen, which uses nuclear, will win out. But we have such an advantage that you just cannot create. Look at Europe. It does not have enough water in order to create the hydrogen that it's going to require. If we get going quickly, we'll have a huge amount of jobs here, great export revenues that will help the Chancellor.
Great. Laura, do you have some thoughts on Miranda's question around commercialisation?
Yes, I'm very lucky. I'm on the board of something called the Energy Systems Catapult, and what we do is promote young technologies and in many ways integrate them and introduce them to the energy system itself. And the energy system, as I say, is run by 400 people, most of whom know each other's golf handicap, right? So it's a small crowd. And the crowd needs to open up and to be able to procure, and I'd love to hear Chris on this, because be able to procure with small innovators and these very large companies meeting these very small entrepreneurs is often a little bit like oil and water, and so sometimes it's a complicated relationship. But there is something called the Valley of Death, and the Valley of Death is this innovation to deployment to scale. And the UK has been notably bad at it for many years in lots of different technologies. I think that industrial strategies that are actually regional strategies are really, really important. And I think we've got to really understand, and Chris S rather than Chris OS was saying that the Northeast with Ben Houchen, he has got a very clear vision, proposition, and as a result is crowding in both investment, technology, and smaller companies that are there to scale. Each different locality, I always say location, location, location. Each locality has got different natural assets, different industrial and commercial assets, and we need to support these areas to come up with their own sets of proposition and then put some money behind it. Because actually we've got all the opportunity here to really own some of this exciting stuff.
That leads quite nicely on to this, Chris, if that's all right, following on from some of Laura's questions. Do you think green hydrogen is possible?
So I think the challenge around hydrogen is actually the UK has an opportunity to move away from this sort of rainbow-coloured taxonomy on hydrogen, creating our low-carbon hydrogen standard, which will recognise that we're on a transition. We'll start with blue. If we're going to use the colour thing, we're going to turquoise, and then gradually, it will decarbonise as the industries themselves, take off and we level up supply and demand. The challenge at the moment is we have a limited demand, which means that while everyone wants to rush for green, we can't make the perfect the enemy of the good. We are on a process, and that's why having this low carbon hydrogen standard, I think, will place the UK in a strong position compared to what the UK has done, the EU has done with their taxonomy and got in a real mess over nuclear, for example. We just need to recognise the carbon intensity and recognise the emissions production and sort of get away from this false divide. And that reflects back, I think, into the ESG question that sometimes we've created frameworks that actually work against decarbonisation and actually understanding what we need to do. Personally, I would sort of move the the S and the G away from the E, if I could. Ultimately, we are we're creating new net zero markets, and again, one of the reasons why I'm not necessarily in favour of Rosebank is because I just think it's going to become a stranded asset. And actually, when we look at investments that are being made, on the basis of criteria, we're seeing investments in fossil fuels 10 years ago were 6 times out of solar. Now, for the first time, solar has overtaken the fossil fuel market, and there's nothing we can do about this. This is just the new economic reality that net zero has brought this country. This is the energy transition as it is happening here and now, but we've got to make sure it's a just transition. So we've got to make sure we look after our existing workforce, not give them false hope that the oil and gas industry is going to continue well beyond into the 2100s and beyond. Let's make sure we create the offshore industries passports, the skills passports, because the people who are working in oil and gas are the same people who'll be working in CCUS and hydrogen. Let's make sure that we have the purportability to make sure that the industry, as it is now, transitions effectively to the future industries that will be developed. But then also, when it comes to SMEs in comparison to the big guns, how can we ensure that we've got this opportunity for smaller projects to thrive? At the moment, again, the frameworks just don't work. The UK Investment Bank is offering up this £5 million as the minimum amount. And actually, there are plenty of projects, particularly community-based projects, that don't need £5 million, but they just got to get started. And that's where a regional-based approach could be very exciting in creating a regional portfolio fund that individuals can invest in. And for everyone who says net zero is a cost and it's going to be the taxpayer that's paying for everything is on the line, actually, let's be innovative about the policy and investment frameworks. Let's not just be innovative about the technologies. If you look at, like in my patch down in Bristol, Bristol City Council have done a deal with Amoresco, a Boston company, to decarbonise their heat network, which is £7 million worth of public funding, has crowded in £424 million worth of private funding. And they see a rate of return on this over the longer term. So let's not think in the 20th century models of somehow it's just going to be the taxpayer or the householder who's paying for this. The householder will benefit from having lower costs of bills that will be no longer linked to gas, particularly if we look at break the link between sort of gas and electricity prices and rebalance those. But ultimately, if we can catch this moment now, the revolution that is taking place, this industrial revolution, the green industrial revolution, is also a financial revolution that we've got to make sure we set the frameworks effectively to crowd in international private investment.
And finally, David, from that kind of batch of questions, thinking about clean hydrogen and the production of it, how do we ramp it up to the kind of level that we may need to decarbonise any number of sectors?
Well, first of all, everything that's been said already about hydrogen I totally agree with. Wouldn't necessarily agree with everything in total that was just said. When, in particular, I think MP Chris, if I can call you that, Chris, is in his comments about how there's nobody in the oil and gas industry today who thinks, I'll just be an oil and gas industry person forever, it's just always going to be oil and gas. Oil and gas companies, particularly in this country, are way ahead of the curve compared to other countries in terms of already being part of that net zero transition. If you get the opportunity, visit the BP stand, they'll tell you all about it. They've got this massive big board in 3 words, 3 very simple words. It's a question of and, not or. It's not a question of energy security or net zero, it's energy security and net zero. You can protect the economy, you can support jobs, you can do it all. And one of the things, by the way, I should let you know as well, I used to work in the oil and gas industry until I was elected in 2017. And back then in 2017, there probably was a predominantly oil and gas industry that I left. There was the beginnings of the transition to net zero, but so much more on that journey now. Every single oil and gas company I come across these days are well down that track. And that's equally true for the people who work in the industry. The skills that they have are just as transferable, probably more than 90% of the skills needed for the renewable future. Renewable energy, if it was nothing but renewable, already exist in the oil and gas industry. It's also true of the supply chains. The service companies that support the oil and gas industry or have traditionally supported the oil and gas industry are getting more and more into supporting renewables as well. They're doing both and they're transitioning along with everyone else. On the subject of hydrogen, just to get back to that question, like I said, I agreed with pretty much everything that was said already. I would only add one of the issues we have, it's in a very unusual situation we have with hydrogen, is we don't have a demand because we don't have a supply. and we don't have a supply because we don't have a demand. So that should lead to the conclusion, well, why do we bother? Well, we bother because hydrogen is this miracle fuel that has a waste product called H2O, which is water. It's just, why wouldn't we just do everything with hydrogen? Well, part of the problem is we don't have enough of it, and everybody wants it. So one idea that I'm not sure I agree with, but it was presented to me a couple of months ago, was import ammonia. Not LNG, but ammonia, which is the energy required to make ammonia in the first place and then ship it here and then split it up into its component parts to get the hydrogen. The idea being to create a supply chain, but it would necessarily start by being very, very dirty, so it kind of goes against the grain. But I think we need to go through the blue to green journey. There are some proponents of green hydrogen out there that thinks we are wasting our time with blue hydrogen, and that's a perfectly acceptable opinion to have, but we're just not going to have the amounts of green hydrogen we need. We're not even going to have the amounts of blue, pink, yellow, I think, is created by solar. White is the hydrogen you can actually drill for and find pure hydrogen. I don't know exactly how that's going to work. But we need to create the supply chains to create the demand and vice versa. And that's something that the government has got a strategy to do exactly that.
Okay, great. Any more questions? I have spotted Clem in the front. You've got a question to the Secretary of State, so I might come back to you. We've got a few down the aisle. There's a gentleman there as well, Finn.
Hello? Yeah, I feel like I pushed in there, sorry. Hello, Mike Reynolds from Gren Energy. I was just interested, we've heard lots and lots and lots today about hydrogen. It feels like the hydrogen working group meeting. I wanted to just ask a question about the view of the panel on the role that more centralised systems like district heating networks will play in the transition, particularly with the segue, the connection with industry, where you have a lot of industry that produces a lot of waste heat and currently dumps it in the sky, whereas a lot of markets have mature district heating networks take that and put it into pipes and sell it to customers. And it was currently dumped, so technically it could be quite cheap. And I was just interested in the panel's view on that and what could be done to accelerate the deployment of district heating. We've had the Green Heat Networks Fund, we've had the Heat Networks Investment Programme before that, but actually that's not really accelerated it so much as it's competed with private capital. So I'm just interested in how do we make this bigger, faster, please. Thank you.
Wonderful. There's one behind you as well, Finn.
Thank you, Emerine Raza. I'm Director of High Forest Capital, leading Tenorez, which is a renewable initiative, venture initiative. My question is, we talked about cost and we talked about going to scale. How can we use in the UK leading on CFDs in renewables, which we have done? Can we use CFD for land for long-term finance for alternate energy supply chains to ensure we remain cost competitive with China, US and EU?
Fab. I think there's a third one right at the back. I can see a hand up.
Hi, thank you so much. Frank Asker from UK Steel. I think we've seen on industrial decarbonisation the government moving quite a bit in the last couple of weeks. Earlier this year we saw the supercharger where government committed to lowering industrial electricity prices, and here a couple of weeks ago we saw them commit to investing in decarbonising Tata Steel's plant in Port Talbot over to electrify steel making. But one piece of the puzzle is missing in many ways, and that's kind of level playing field on carbon pricing. When you're looking at the global steel market, 90% of steel is made in countries with no carbon pricing or very, very low carbon pricing. You're talking about a couple of pounds per ton of carbon compared to us here with 40 to 80. So really kind of considering that kind of steel competing on a global playing field, should we move to putting a carbon price on imported steel as well? Should we have a carbon border adjustment mechanism to ensure that steel can actually compete when you kind of decarbonize these industries to make sure they can actually compete? Thanks.
Wonderful. Okay, district heat networks, CFDs. Also might expand that question a little bit to talk about allocation round 6 and the fallout from AR5 would be really interesting. And then something about industrial electricity prices, carbon pricing, and CBAM. So loads in there. Laura, I'm going to come to you first, and I'm going to ask you about the CFDs. What does government need to do to make sure that AR6 is a success? And can we expand CFDs into other sectors?
So what we we certainly have to listen to the industry, and I think the industry spoke rather clearly when offshore wind didn't come up with any auction response. So that is about price and cost, right? And to be frank, whatever cost they were actually pitching it at, it would have been much less than gas. So I think it's something that needs to be resolved. But the CFD mechanism is really interesting, and I've been working on... So if what you're doing is you're retrofitting your home to make it very energy efficient, that as an ask of you personally is probably the equivalent of asking Ørsted how much it costs for them to build an offshore wind farm, i.e. comparatively, because I don't seem to have 20,000 quid sort of hanging around to do it, or 10,000 or whatever. Actually, what we should be looking at is, because demand and supply in the system are equal, not necessarily in scale but in value, should we not be looking at small distributed CFDs? And I spoke to, so whether that be for energy efficiency, whether that be for community energy projects, whether that be for, citywide infrastructure decarbonisation. So then I spoke to one of the pension funds and said, would you take up a CFD that was a distributed, multi-locational proposition? And they said that they would. And then I spoke to the low carbon contracts company, and they said that they would design it so you could have micro CFDs that could actually deliver us demand, i.e. customer-based solutions to decarbonisation, community-based and city-based propositions. So I think the CFD model is seen very much as being a big generators model. I think it can be repurposed, and I think that it can actually be repurposed for the benefit of customers as well as large companies.
Wow, that sounds fantastic. It's not something I've heard about, so yeah, interested to learn a bit more, Laura. MP Chris, thinking about the district heat network question, and if you've got any thoughts on how to make the next CFD round a success as well, be interested to hear your thoughts.
So, heat networks incredibly important, not just also to reduce demand on the grid, and the government has been clear identifying, I can't remember how many gigawatts worth of potential energy that sort of, the heat networks could provide, but we do need to invest in it, and the way I think forward is by using energy area sort of planning that the Energy Systems Cabinet has taken forwards, because again, a bit like to come back to the Bristol City Leap point, and I did a report called Mission Retrofit that came out this week, calling on the Chancellor to announce net zero city leaps. Is that if we know what we need to know, you then have a template plan by which to go to private investors to sort of set out what they can invest in. And at the moment, we've got this chicken and egg scenario where we've identified potential heat networks can be adopted, but we haven't got the finance mechanism in which to do it. And it's not going to be up to the local authorities to do this, in reality, given all the other pressures they're facing. So how we can ensure we can bring private finance investment in, and it's, there is more money than there is willing to be spent on these projects. So we should be just linking it up. Partly having a sort of net zero delivery agency would help achieve this, but it's really important. And it's not rocket science. Like Gateshead Council put in this sort of water heat pump situation in 2008, and it powers the whole council's network. And it's really important that we reflect on it's not just obviously individual household heat pumps, but water heat pumps for big larger heat projects. And then I think on the carbon price. We must, if we're going to make sure we retain public confidence in net zero, we've got to start with the principle that decarbonisation must never lead to deindustrialisation. The challenge is that we can't compete with China on cheap, high-carbon steel anyway. Those jobs are going abroad anyway. And, the disaster around the comms for the Port Talbot announcement that would have been all 6,000 jobs that would have been lost if it wasn't actually for delivering a green steel future project that is also potentially going to save these jobs that have been lost in reinvesting in a green industrial supply chain to supply the port, and that's the challenges around optics. I mean, that was badly managed in terms of the comms, but taking forwards, the challenge around green steel, and we've seen this at an international level with the breakthrough agenda, is all other countries are grappling with this issue around how do we support a green manufacturing industry. We've seen in the United States a manufacturing renaissance on the back of the IRA. So how can we ensure that we create the mechanism? And that may involve a CBAM, and we should work closely with the EU on that, but it should also be aligned with low carbon product standards, whether they're mandatory, I think they probably need to be, which then goes out and all guns blazing exports these materials and allies them with a high quality product. Making the link between low carbon steel, green steel, whatever you want to call it. Now, whether that's made through hydrogen, through nuclear, as Sweden's looking at, whether it's done through electric arc furnaces, it doesn't matter. But the challenge is that we see this as an opportunity and not a cost. And we have an industrial strategy, if that's what you want to call it, that places this as an opportunity the UK can lead on, because we are not going to be able to outcompete China on low quality, high carbon steel.
Chris, so what do you think to a carbon price? Do you think this is a good idea, a bad idea? How should we be aligning ourselves or deliberately not aligning ourselves with other countries and, for example, the EU CBAM, the EU ETS pricing? Where do you think we should go on that one?
It's really difficult. It's and I sympathise a lot. I used to work in the steel industry, so the issue you have with steel in China is quite a big one. I think in an ideal world we would price the environmental damage that carbon does appropriately, and then we would need CFDs. We wouldn't need anything at all, because green technology would be far more cost competitive. But we don't live in an ideal world. We live in a world where governments compete with each other. So I think it's actually quite a nuanced question. I think we've got to agree with what Chris said, or MP Chris as we call him, about, and I think it's quite eloquently put that decarbonisation should not equal deindustrialisation. But I do think that we have to look at each individual instance on its own. I think that I don't think there's any one single answer. If I may come in just on the CFDs, one of the things we've got to really challenge ourselves is. So I think CFDs are absolutely fantastic for establishing a new industry like hydrogen. You're right. There's lots of money, people want to make it, a lot of people want to buy it, but nobody's going to buy it because nobody's going to make it. So CFDs could be used to establish that industry. CFDs have done unbelievably well for our offshore wind industry. But we probably have to pause at one point and say, do we still want to offer CFDs to every offshore wind farm as it comes up? And I don't know what the answer is. So CFDs gives consumers certainty of price, but I run the UK's largest energy supplier in the UK. We are a profit-seeking enterprise. We're paid to take risks, and we've just got to make sure that as government, thankfully, really help with things, whether it's the boiler upgrade scheme, whether it's CFDs, that we don't, as companies, become hooked on that. We don't become hooked on subsidies, because ultimately, the taxpayer pays for that. And Chris, you mentioned about a just transition. The just transition, we've got to make sure that this is not subsidies that come from the poor to the middle class and to the wealthy. So we've really got to think about this. The CFDs are fantastic tools, but we should pause every so often and say, are they still needed for, why do we still need them for offshore wind? Maybe we do, maybe we want to fix the price. Or maybe we say most energy companies, if you look, the UK needs a lot more electricity over the next 10, 20, 30 years. Why are companies not simply investing in that?
David, linked to that, I wonder if you could, we will try and get one more round of questions, I promise. But before we do that, David, I wonder about kind of taxpayers' money. How do we use taxpayers' money most efficiently in the net zero transition? How do we make sure that we're spending taxpayers' money in the best possible way to get value for money?
I mean, that's a very good question, and I think it was one of the Chris's, I can't remember which one, said earlier about how, and it was Chris, Centrica Chris, I think it was said that the customer doesn't care where the power comes from. They care that we're doing the best for the planet. They care about what we are doing to the planet. They care about climate change. But it's probably more correct to say they don't care where the power comes from when it goes out. Like if they have a power cut for whatever, they don't care that the wind wasn't blowing or the sun wasn't shining or the gas wasn't flowing. And so we have to make sure whatever we do, whatever we decide, we're taking the public with us. I think one of the main benefits of the Prime Minister's statement a couple of weeks ago was, and I know this from knocking on doors and talking to constituents, people feel a bit less anxious. They feel that they've been given a bit of flexibility, a bit of time, a bit of choice, and they feel like they could be part of that net zero journey now. Regardless, it's not so much about the cost. It's about that. I can't remember if I've said it here today. I've used this quote about 5 times today. People don't resist change. People resist change being done to them, or that feeling that it's being done to them. So if they feel like they've been given a bit of a choice, a bit of flexibility, they'll be less concerned about the cost. If I could go back to a couple of the questions just very quickly. On district heating systems, I'm a great fan of district heating systems because I hate waste. The idea that there's heat being generated and just going into the atmosphere, why aren't we capturing that more? I know there's cost-effectiveness ways of doing that, but one of the things I think we can do, and there's a project, it's not in my constituency, sadly, but it's just across the boundary, where they're building an energy from waste plant from scratch with carbon capture and storage as part of the design. So it's not a retrofit idea, it's all about capturing the carbon. Even if you weren't capturing the carbon, energy from burning waste, incinerating waste, doesn't sound particularly attractive, but the CO2 you get from burning the waste is not as bad as the methane you would get if it was in landfill. So it's not the best idea, but it's better than a worse idea, if that makes sense. On CFDs, I think I remember somebody saying recently, it took about 20 years to get to the point with offshore wind where we had a CFD system that works. Now, whether we can just copy and paste that CFD system into other technologies, I'm not really sure that's necessarily 100% copy and pasteable, but we need to be careful about how we develop those. On the subject of imported steel, again, I think we need to be careful. I mean, I'm not an expert in steel myself, but what I do know is not just for steel, but also cement. We're going to need a lot of both of those materials to create the renewable solutions. So we have to be careful we don't cut off the supply to actually develop those. And then finally on AR6, I think what we need to do, and I've already provided this input to government, is I think we do need to be a bit more nuanced. I think, as Centrica Chris was saying, maybe not every project requires that financial support. But when we're looking at new technologies like, floating offshore wind, for example, there's some wind projects that have their own storage battery systems installed, so that's kind of new. So new geographies like the South Irish Sea, the Southwest. Maybe we need to be a bit more nuanced and split out different geographies. I don't know if this is what you were referring to with micro CFDs. But a bit like we did with tidal stream energy. What we did with that was, initially, we just lumped it in with offshore wind because it was the sea. And what we did was we ring-fenced that out. We said, right, let's do that differently, carve that out from other offshore renewable energy. And we've seen that go from strength to strength. I think we need to have a bit more nuanced approach to the different types of offshore wind and the different places for offshore wind. Because if we develop offshore wind on the west coast as much as we have on the east coast, well, people always say, oh, what if the wind doesn't blow? It'll be blowing somewhere. Pretty sure of it.
Great. I'm afraid we don't have time for any more questions.
Oh,
I'm sorry, but can I maybe collar one of the speakers at the end? I'm aware that some of our speakers have to dash off. So I'm going to allow them one final sentence on what is the one thing that the government needs to do to get us back into the race for industrial revolution. I'm going to start with David, work down the panel, finish with Chris, and then we'll wrap up. Just one sentence. What is the one thing that the government needs to do?
We need to take the most advantage of the situation we've had for a long time as being a part of the world, an economy that investors do want to invest in. We're not the cheapest, we're not the easiest place to operate, but historically, whether it's oil and gas or renewables or other parts of the economy, investors have wanted to invest here. What we can't afford to do is be caught napping. Like the hare was in the tortoise and hare race. We're way ahead of the curve. I'll take a nap under a tree, and then we get overtaken by the tortoise IRA system.
Okay, so not napping. Great, yeah. Love it. Laura, one thing that the government needs to do.
we need to ensure that we have a just transition that absolutely values what we as consumers, the demand side, is as valuable as the supply side in our electricity system. And that is being super consumer focused, really delivering exciting propositions and really unlocking all these decarbonisation assets, whether they be EVs, heat pumps, PV, etc. That's where we'll win hearts and minds as well.
Great. MP Chris.
Listen to the Net Zero review, Mission Zero. I mean, I would say 22nd of November is a critical date. Jeremy Hunt, at the time when I published the report, said they would come up with a response to the Inflation Reduction Act at the autumn statement. We need to hold him to account on this. We need a net zero investment plan that sets out long-term strategic priorities for all these industries that we've spoken about to give business the certainty and confidence that is much needed.
Great. And finally, Centrica Chris. I've learned that I should not put two people named the same next to each other next time. Lesson. Anyway, Chris.
Look, I think government needs to be ambitious, be bold, be optimistic, be quick, and we need to recognise that we need to do this with consumers, not to consumers.
Wonderful. We have got, in an hour's time, we've got our reception with Theresa May and Andy Street, so please do come back in an hour's time. We're going to have to turn the room around. Please do come back in an hour's time. But before you go, please, thanks again to David, to Laura, to Chris, and to Centrica for sponsoring. Please.